first residential school in Canadian history opened in 1828 in Brantford, Ontario. Initially, Indigenous leaders had hoped that the Euro-Canadian education would allow their youth to learn the modern skill set needed for a successful transition into Canadian society. But the residential schools were funded by the Canadian government in an attempt to destroy Indigenous culture, as well as assimilate the Indigenous youth into the rest of Canada. The main purpose of the residential schools was to remove Indigenous youth from their homes, isolate them from the influence of tradition, language, and culture. Or, as said by Duncan Campbell Scott, to kill the Indian in the child.
As a 5-year-old child, you walk into the school and you see so many other children crying. And then you have the older children come to you and tell you not to cry because it's going to get worse. But to walk up those stairs and to hear this woman speaking like English and telling me like, get in that shower, wash yourself, wash everything off, wash off that brown skin. And there is soap, I don't know what kind of soap it was, but it burned. Like I remember the burn and the scrubbing and cry, like wanted to cry because it hurt.
Through the 169-year lifespan of the Canadian residential school's history, over 150,000 kids were forcibly separated from their homes and disallowed any practice of Indigenous culture. Children were brutally punished if they practiced their original culture or broke strict rules set in place. Survivors to this day still describe the residential school's ongoing physical, sexual, emotional, and psychological abuse as horrendous. It is estimated that up to 6,000 children died at residential schools, but it's impossible to say with certainty as the government stopped recording deaths of children in the schools because the rates were so high. It was even said by Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, that when the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages. Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. The schools operated in every province and territory, with the exception of Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland. And as said by Duncan Campbell Scott, it was the residential school's object to continue until there was not a single Indian in Canada that had not been absorbed into the body politic. Still to this day, survivors recall the unsanitary conditions, the beatings, the abuse, the starvation, and overcrowding. The legacy of the schools is that of compromising the health of generations of Aboriginal children. It took until 1997, a mere 22 years ago, for the last residential school to finally close.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history. Two primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their home, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. These objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some saw it, as was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. Today, we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country.
Following the apology speech that Prime Minister Stephen Harper made, the Government of Canada created the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was granted $75 million to travel across the country collecting testimony from over 6,500 participants and hosted 7 national events to engage and educate the public on the Indian residential school systems. As of December 18th, 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission closed its doors and issued 94 calls to action and a 6-volume report.